Hello, everybody. And in this video, we're going to discuss how to do a case study in the MBA program. So one of the, cool things about the case studies that you'll be doing in the MBA program is that each one of them actually happened. So we're not talking about something that could happen or might happen or some super weird thing that probably would never happen. Either the good news or the bad news is that each one of these actually happened. So, and what we're going to do in this video is really talk about not what you need for any specific class, but what you need for all classes. So what we're going to discuss is the basic requirements for you to do for every single case study that you do throughout the MBA program. While each professor probably will have additional things for you to do that are focused on that course's content, what we're going to discuss in this video is what you need to do for every one of these, in addition to what the professor maybe is telling you, hey, focus on these 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 areas. So I've got a PowerPoint slide that hopefully we're going to get up. And well, all right, we'll go with it like this. So within, and again, this is not specific to any class, this is all classes. So basically, the case study is a method designed by Harvard to really teach MBA students. So most of these cases are the same cases that the students in Harvard are getting. So I guess you get the same learning that everybody gets in MBA programs. But one of the base or general things about a case study is that usually there is not one right answer. There are, just like in any business, again, business would be so easy if there was one right answer for every issue. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. There are many good answers and many bad answers. So, and I will say this final bullet down here is true that professors are less interested in which right answer you come up with than, I put here, how did you prove it? But really, it's how you support your recommendation. What background do you have that supports why the company should do what they're doing? So I will say that a lot of case studies have noise in it, meaning there's information in there that is not relevant to the situation. And again, I think in most of these cases, they try to make it as close to real life as humanly possible. If you have a problem with the company that you work for, there are a lot of opinions, both what the problem is and what the possible solutions are. Many are valid and many are not. And it's really up to you, whether it's your company or in the case study, to determine what you feel are the relevant facts and present those, and what you feel are irrelevant facts and you leave those out. Also, again, just like in life, the case studies might have information that you feel you need that is missing. If that's the case, you can either try to research, meaning Google it and try to figure it out, or you make assumptions, and that is okay in the case. Just writing, I'm assuming the following, and then you're basing your decision both on the facts of the case and the assumption that you made. And again, there is nothing wrong with that. The last thing is, again, some of the cases follow a very linear structure, and some of them are more like an interview where we're interviewing 10 different people. So some of the information that is relevant is really covered in over, let's say, 3 different pages on 3 different interviews of 3 different individuals that you kind of have to piece together. It isn't like many of the undergraduate cases where it's all laid out for you in specific order. So that's a little bit about cases in general, business cases. So what do you need to do? And again, these apply to all cases. Obviously, the first one is read the case. The next one is identify the problem. We're going to go over each one of these in a little bit more detail, provide some form of analysis, develop alternatives or courses of action, apply the law, and that's specific to law courses, or if the case happens to do with employment law or something like that. And then finally, and this is the focus of all the cases, is make a recommendation. And I know I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but I will tell you that the worst case study analyses that are received don't do these things, and they spend more time summarizing what happened than they do identifying the problem and making recommendations. And if you're getting to the end of your case analysis and you've got 1 page on recommendation and 5 pages on what happened, I'll tell you that that's wrong. It should be the other way around. 1 page on what happened and 4 pages on your recommendations and your plan for implementation and all the research you did in doing your recommendation. So having said that, I will say that when I say research is different in these cases than in the undergrad program. Usually when you hear research in the undergrad program, it means going to the library, reading books or articles, summarizing those books and articles, and turning them in. More of a literature review of a topic. And that's not the research that you need to do in these cases. Most of the research you need to do is either in your analysis or in your recommendation. How much does something cost to implement? Things like that you should look up and support. So in other words, you shouldn't, do a mic drop of here's my recommendation, boom, and leave it, because no business implements a recommendation without knowing how much it's going to cost, or similarly, how much money it's going to bring in. So without estimates for those, no recommendation is going to get implemented, which right there means that your recommendation is not good. So we'll go on. So identify the problem, and I will say that this sounds much easier than it is in many situations. And I say that because in many situations, people will talk about the symptom of the problem, not the problem. To give an example that hopefully everybody can relate to, regardless of how much work experience you have, I'll use a university, and I'll use Limestone as an example, but it's really true of any university that you went to in undergrad. So imagine a school says, okay, we have a retention problem. And usually you'll interview a bunch of people, or the interview will be written in the case, and people will have a whole bunch of lists of what they think the problem is, or what the retention problem is. And really, retention is a symptom of another problem. Something is causing the retention issue, but usually you don't hear, oh, we've got a problem, I don't know, with admissions, or we've got a problem with the education, we've got a problem with athletics, we've got a problem somewhere else, you hear, oh, we have a retention problem. And again, they're really talking about a symptom of the problem and not the problem. So in many cases, you have to figure out what you believe the real problem is. The cases in many cases make this difficult, but it reflects real life. I will say, I didn't mention this earlier, but all these cases have real names in them. So they're the real people that did this. So you read these cases, and many times, whether it's the CEO, CFO, sales, whatever, really screwed up, your name is not protected. So if you work for one of these companies and a case study is made after you, your name is not protected. So for years, graduate students across the country will be reading your name. As a matter of fact, one of the guys I worked with at WorldCom, he's in one of the cases in our textbook. So he worked right down the hall from me, and I think spent 5 years in prison. But anyway, we'll go with, and I'll use limestone as an example. If we were to say, okay, we've got a retention problem, my guess is no one in the company is standing up and saying, yes, I'm the problem, I'm the one that is incompetent, I'm the one that should be fired because of my incompetence, and therefore we get somebody in good, and retention would go up. It wouldn't happen here, and my guess is it does not happen in your company that you work for. So usually what happens is everybody points the finger at someone else. So if it's Limestone, you've got Chris Finnessy, who's in charge of admissions, and he says, well, we've got, by the way, I'm not saying that A, this is true, or B, these people would say this. I'm making a situation up. So he says, hey, the problem is student services. There's not enough to do on campus, and that is causing students to leave. Well, who's ever in charge of student services probably is not going to say, yes, I'm the problem and I'm incompetent. He's going to say, oh, no, I think the problem is athletics. Athletics is recruiting too many students, or they're recruiting students and promising them that they're going to start, and they get here and they're number 35 down the bench, and then they end up leaving. Well, again, athletics is probably not going to say, yes, we're the problem. They're going to say, hey, again, I'm trying to make a whole circular thing here. They're going to say, hey, the problem is academics, that either we don't have the right majors, or the professors we have are horrible and students are leaving because the professors are horrible. Well, again, now the provost isn't going to say, yes, I hired all horrible professors and I'm not doing anything about it. She's probably going to, again, to make this circular, say the problem is really admissions. And our retention issue is admissions is recruiting people and admitting people that flunk out. And therefore, that's what our retention problem is. So now you have, I think I said 5 people who all pointed the finger at somebody else, which is what normally happens in business. And you are left with determining what you believe either the problem or the problems really are. And the cool thing about this is, in these case studies, each one of you could pick something different, and that's okay. You just have to support why you believe that that is the problem. And the cool thing is that since it was in the case, there's at least some validity to picking that. So y'all just have to pick 1, 2, 3, whatever you think the real problem truly is, to say that that's what you think the problem is. And from a professor standpoint, isn't it great that not all your papers will be exactly the same, because hopefully y'all have differences of opinion on what the problem really is. I do think this last bullet down here, it might be helpful to write out what you believe the problems are, because I will tell you how I grade these. Now, I don't know what other professors do, but I can tell you how I do it. Is because all of you will come up with something different. I write down what you say the problems are as I'm reading your paper. And then when I get to the end and you start having recommendations, I start checking off which problems that you identified, you said were the problems, which ones you're actually attempting to solve. And then I assess how well you did on those. But the worst ones are when you say what you believe the problem is and then you solve a different problem. And I'm like, well, how does this, like, I don't know, you say, hey, the problem, again, pick any one of them. You say the problem is the professors and they're horrible and they all need to be fired. And then you go about talking about improving the food in the cafeteria. Well, as the professor, I'm sitting there like, what does this have to do with the instruction? Because you're solving a problem that you say doesn't exist. So again, it might be helpful to write it out. And then as you're going through making recommendations, um, make sure you're solving the problem that you identified. All right, and yes, as you go through these, your problems might lead you to other issues and problems. And again, this might lead to some assumptions that you're making. And again, it's okay to make assumptions. You should put in that you're assuming the following facts when you do that. Um, and this is where teamwork, I think, actually helps, that maybe setting up a call after everybody's had a chance to read the case to brainstorm what everybody thinks the problem is. And in many cases, you might have 3 or 4 people on each team, and you might have 6 or 7 problems that the team actually thinks, and what you really need to do is come to some kind of consensus and get that number down to 2 or 3 of what you really think to start solving. um, Obviously that's a little bit tougher on a individual case, but definitely it's, while there are some disadvantages to team case studies, that is one of the advantages of team case studies. And one of the reasons we do team case studies is it is more applicable to the outside world, where you've got to deal with other people, deal with other people's opinions, recommendations, and things like that. And you are supposed to leave here as a master in business. Um, and dealing with people is one of those things. So that is why we kind of do the team analysis or teamwork. Next slide is to perform some kind of an analysis on what you've identified as the problem. Um, what are the strengths and weaknesses, kind of going through a SWOT analysis of the company to help determine what recommendations you have, because obviously making a recommendation based on a strength of a company is much easier to implement than basing a recommendation on a known weakness of that company. Again, it might require some external research, meaning searches of that company, searches of what other companies in the industry are doing, things like that. The dreaded finance, that you have to make sure that your recommendation is implementable. So for example, a recommendation, using the whole retention thing, a recommendation for Harvard that might cost a few $1,000,000 is definitely implementable for Harvard. That same recommendation for Limestone may not be a viable recommendation. So you do have to look at and make sure that your recommendations are actually viable for whatever company you're doing the analysis of. Oops, that kind of went forward, huh? All right. So, well, there's the viable thing. The best case analyses have different courses of action that they've thought of, um, that are viable. And I get that shutting down the doors and stopping business might be, in your mind, a viable solution, but I'm going to guess that in most professors' minds, that you have a problem, and recommending to the CEO that they just file bankruptcy and go out of business is probably not considered a viable recommendation. So make sure your recommendations are viable. The best solutions have short, medium, and long-term strategies. In other words, that just like with retention, there might be things that we could implement in the short term, meaning this year. There may be other things that will be in the 1 to 2 years, and other things that are more longer term, that are more strategy related. So I will tell you that the best case studies include an implementation plan that includes all of these things. For example, a short-term one is, hey, if we need a new person to do something, that's relatively short-term. We can hire somebody in the next 3 to 6 months to do that. Something else, building a building, is definitely long-term. It's, it takes, in a business, you're talking 3 to 5 years just to do anything. So again, plans of action include plan equipment, research and development, employees, training, marketing, whatever you can think of. And then make a recommendation. And I know I have just recommendation, but it might be that you have like 5 different things that that you're recommending the company do. One of the biggest things is most recommendations have weaknesses or risk involved in that recommendation. And what I'm saying is, and this is true in business too, it is better when you're making a recommendation to your boss, it is better for you to identify the weaknesses or risks in your recommendation. Hey, there's a risk that if X happens, either this revenue could go down, or these expenses could go up, whatever the case may be. It is far better for you to identify those. And again, this is true in business or in these case studies, than for the professor or your boss or somebody else in the audience to highlight weaknesses in your recommendation. Because it kind of cuts it off at the knees when you've identified weaknesses in your recommendation or risks in your recommendation, however you want to do it. So in summary, again, I can't emphasize this enough, that just like in businesses, I will tell you that the professors and or your boss know what happened, whether it's in the case or what's really happening in your business. You don't need to go, like, you would not present 25 minutes to the CEO of the company what's going on in their company and the need for it. They already know it. Now, that isn't to say that you shouldn't put any facts in the case, in your case analysis, but certainly not, like, actually, I'm looking at my background with the 1845. The fact that Limestone University was founded in 1845 probably has zero relevance to any issue that we are facing today. Actually, the fact that we were in 1845 and an all-girls school probably has no relevance to what's going on today. So putting that in adds nothing to the paper other than filler, which adds nothing to the paper. So now, that isn't to say, again, that you can't or shouldn't put in facts from the case. You should, to support both your problem, what you've identified as the problem, and what you've identified as your recommendations. But again, the focus should be on your recommendations and your plan of implementation and how much it's going to cost, how much your estimated revenue is for your plan, how the company can get through this. So general things like, oh, they should increase marketing are not good recommendations. What marketing should they do? What target market should they do? What actual modes of marketing should they do? What should they focus on? Who should they focus on marketing target market to? All these things, and how much is all that going to cost, are better recommendations. And the last bullet is, and this happens every now and again with MBA students, that they don't want to commit to a course of action. They just throw like 100 different things. That's an exaggeration. They throw in 10 different things and say, well, the company could do any of these. And again, that is not a good recommendation. Look at yourself in each one of these. Is you can look at that you're the CEO of the company, or you were hired and paid, I don't know, a couple $1,000,000 to identify the problem and recommend solutions to the CEO. So any CEO, or I always look at that, I'm taking the place of the CEO. What should I do? That I've got to make a decision. So I look at this as, when I'm making a recommendation, this is what I would do if I was the CEO. So don't sit there and just say, yeah, here's 15 things that the company could do, and leave it at that. So this is in my general case study. As I said before, each one of your professors, and I know in the first class that you take, which is ethics, in your syllabus, there will be a list of things that you'll need to do in addition to these things. And even in these things, the professor might put it in a different format. Like, for example, in the ethics case, it might be that, like for example, one of the questions is, what ethical theory do you think they used? So in other words, what they did, what ethical theory? Well, that doesn't have anything to do with what we just did in this presentation. But another question is, what would you recommend based on, one of the questions was, what do you see as the problem? And then what ethical theory do you think they used? And then what ethical theory do you think they should use, and what recommendation do you have? Well, that falls right into what I'm saying you should do for every single case study, which is identify the problem, come up with courses of action, and make detailed recommendations that are viable and implementable. And I think those are the big things. And the better you do on the detailed recommendations, viable and implementable recommendations, the better your case studies will be. So I hope this helped and answered some questions that y'all might have in the realm of completing a case study for the MBA program. And I look forward to making the next video.